But we are now going to be moving on to the next panel, which is with a series of funders. Again, you will have an opportunity to ask questions. You can put them into the chat function. I have warm-up questions. I don't want to have to use them because my questions won't be nearly as good as yours. So if you can think of questions, that would be really helpful. We have Stewart Macgregor, Funding Manager from the Robertson Trust, Katherine Sellar, Community Programmes Manager from People's Postcode Lottery, Neil Ritch, Scotland Director, the National Lottery Community Fund, and Ben Cairns, Director, Institute for Voluntary Action Research. They're going to tell us a little bit about how they've been supporting organisations and what their priorities are for the next year, or however much we can plan over the next year. So I'm going to start off with Stewart, if you don't mind.
I don't know how I managed to go first. It must be in height order, because I don't know, I think it's a toss-up between me and Neil. Anyway, no, delighted to be here. Sorry I couldn't be here earlier today. We've been working tirelessly on the development of our new strategy, which some of you may be aware is going to have a much sharper focus on poverty and trauma, which, as you all know, affects people's health and well-being in various ways. So we're looking at that as a trust-wide strategy across all the things that we do, which of course includes our funding offer to the sector as well. So news of that is coming imminently. Towards the end of September, all that information will be available and out there. But you know, it's definitely about having more of a relationship with the sector, a stronger relationship. We've always tried to maintain that and nurture that, but we want to work alongside communities a lot more and work with those organisations who are working with communities at a community level. And over the next 10 years of this strategy, we plan to invest in excess of £200 million into the sector. So we can't do that on our own. We need to be able to build relationships with you and understand the needs of the sector. So we're really excited about the new strategy and looking forward to building kind of trust and relationships. And that links to how we can help support, build resilience within the third sector, within organisations. It has to start and end with trust and mutual understanding. We're not the experts in this area around poverty and trauma. You guys in the sector are working day in, day out with people in organisations affected by it. So we really just want to listen. But as ever, we want to support the sector to remain agile. We can see it. It's been a challenging few months, to say the least, and the agility of the sector and looking at different ways of working has been fantastic. So we need to be in a position to nurture it and support it. And really that can be done by funders, by investment, you know, and smarter investment and listening to the needs of people that need the money. So it's you guys. Is that okay, Tala? Is that enough? I don't know, I've got 2 minutes. Is that 2 minutes?
That's great. Yes, I'm so glad that my strictness on timing is being respected. Thank you, Stewart. Katherine, can I ask you to come in?
Yes, hiya. So I'm Katherine. I'm Community Programmes Advisor at the People's Postcode Lottery, and I manage our 4 community programmes trusts, which are the ones around my head there. And People's Postcode Lottery fundraises for 57 different promoting societies, including 20 postcode trusts. And most of the funds are given out in a long-term, flexible way, working with charities like Children First, Missing People, Places to Be. I think some of them are here. And the bit that I look at is the community programmes, and that's the smaller grants of up to £20,000. And what we really want to start doing more of in the community programmes is really looking at how we can be like those other trusts and being more flexible and looking more long term. And we've started to trial core funding for the first time in the most recent funding round, which is something I'm really proud that we're finally doing. And so we've had a specific trust, Postcode Neighbourhood Trust, focusing on good causes that have been impacted by COVID-19, and there's been options to apply for core funding as part of that. So looking forward to next year, we really want to keep that focus on core funding and being flexible and just being as useful as we can to the good causes that we support. And it looks like the amount of funds that we have available should be increasing. So we're hoping to double the amount of funding we have available as part of our community programmes. And yeah, should I talk more about how we've responded to COVID kind of later on?
You can say a few words now, that's no problem at all.
Yep. So we've had a variety of different things. So Postcode Neighbourhood Trust, as I spoke about, supporting charities to adapt or expand services and also supporting organisational resilience. And then we've had Postcode Innovation Trust providing 3.1 million to charities that are already part of the family that are adapting services to respond to COVID. And then we'll also have a new fund launching on the 1st of October called the Postcode Recovery Fund. That might be something that you're interested in, and that'll be for pretty large scale kind of recovery of up to kind of 1.5 million in value. So look out for that one launching on the 1st of October.
Great, Katherine, thank you so much. And Neil, can I come to you next?
Hello, I'm Neil Ritch. It's lovely to see everybody. I usually use Teams, so I really like Zoom because it's a bit cooler. So what we've been doing in Scotland to support folk through the COVID crisis is trying to be as flexible as possible with our existing grant holders, and that's paid a lot of dividends. I think particularly we've said to folk, we trust you, you know what you're doing, you know what's important in your communities. And folk have followed through on that, and that's been really heartening. And I think that's an important lesson. There's been a bit of chat today about power and funding. Funders are nothing without the people they fund delivering projects and doing things, and you should always remember that as folk who apply for funding. We need you just as much as you need us, possibly more. We've tried to focus initially on sort of immediate crisis support. So we've invested, as I said, roughly £10 million in about 1,000 awards to support folk to do things that are really important and urgent now. And we're just pivoting, I suppose, to try to focus more on emerging, not out of crisis, because that's a presumptuous thing to say. Loads of folk are in crisis and going to face real challenges. So it's important not to be too Pollyanna about this stuff and talk about emerging into a bright new future. There's a long old slog to go, which is an important thing around resilience. I think resilience is often about sticking in for the slog. And so we've just published a blog about what we're doing with our funding. We were due actually to have less funding available next year. We're changing that and we're simplifying our offer for the next year or so. And we want to spend a bit of time doing two things: making sure we're still flowing resources into the third sector in Scotland and supporting communities all over Scotland, and learning and thinking about what that means for our longer term activity as a funder. And that's my phone making a noise telling me to stop, and I can't get it to stop making a noise, sorry. There we go. So I'll stop, but I'll post the link to the blog, which is far more eloquent than me anyway.
Thank you so much. I had no idea that in the setup of this and the kind of pre-organising that I was so strict that somebody would put on a timer. So I really appreciate that, Neil.
I'm a gabber, I have to.
That's great. If you could just let other people that I live with know that I'm that strict, that'd be really helpful. And if we could come to Ben next.
Thanks, Sellar. Thanks for inviting me from south of the border. IVAR is an independent charitable research institute specialising in supporting small to medium charities and their funders. And since March, we've been hearing from the leaders of small charities through online support sessions, and we've been providing briefings for funders about their emergency responses. And that work builds on 20 years of research with, for and about funders and long-standing campaigns that we've been running with some people on the screen at the moment around core funding, around reporting and learning. And I want to just share 5 messages from that work. Firstly, and this picks up with what Neil said about a long old slog, the idea of a linear progression from emergency through to recovery and renewal is becoming unhelpful as restrictions are tightened in virus hotspots. A complicated autumn's just started, despite the madness about the moonshot that we heard yesterday. A difficult winter is predicted and medical solutions have yet to be found. So for now, I think all funders are emergency funders. Second, uncertainty, unpredictability, complexity are characteristics of the current normal for all of us, and that will require from all of us patience, empathy, and attention to well-being from all. We're not out of this by a long chalk. Thirdly, thinking specifically about the idea of resilience, it might help to look back at previous moments of pressure and complexity. After the financial crash of 2008, we saw that organizations with a strong sense of themselves, a strong sense of their purpose and their values, and the confidence to work with others were often more likely to flourish and thrive. So funders undoubtedly have a significant part to play with building resilience, and I'll say two things about that in a minute, but it's also about us. It's about our mindset, it's about our attitude, it's about our core. We have seen the best of the sector in the last 6 months. Agility, as Stewart said, ingenuity, creativity, integrity. But we have a responsibility to be the best that we can be, to quote Corra's superb strategic objective, which we ourselves have borrowed. Fourthly, funders and charities need relief from the demands of applying for and distributing 6-month grants. We're hearing from charity leaders, many of whom are managing new needs and increasing demands on their services, about the challenges of staff and personal welfare, about navigating the easing and then the reintroduction of lockdown and reviewing longer term plans. So despite the uncertainty, funders can help by moving on from short-term bursts to more conventional cycles of 1, 3, 5 years. And finally, what's the most precious thing that funders can do? I think it's to recognize that progressive funding, truly progressive funding, is simple funding. It's unrestricted, it's light touch. In the words of organizations in receipt of funding after Grenfell Tower fire, it's easy, it's trusting, it's straightforward, and it's quick. And there is an opportunity here. I think it's a once in a lifetime opportunity, having been 32 years in the sector. We've stepped outside of the normal with immediate emergency responses, and funders can choose to stay outside the normal. We've seen what's possible in an emergency. And if we look into the future, as far as the eye can see, what we see is uncertainty and unpredictability. So it's a future that will require a sustained commitment to flexibility and creative adaptation. That's the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you to all our panelists there. Just a summary of what's being discussed there. Understanding of the complexity of the situation for the third sector, for those that are being funded. Understand that funders need to be empathetic, focus on flexibility and well-being. There's a lot of conversation about restricted funds or unrestricted funds and what does that mean. Focus on strategic priorities, accepting the crisis space that third sector is in and responding to that for a longer period of time. And also talking about complexity becoming the new normal and accepting that complexity that the third sector organisations may be working to as well. I have a fair number of questions here. If we can go to Holly, you've given me 2 or 3 questions there. You're very enthusiastic, that's a good thing.
Thank you.
But if you could maybe pick one of the ones that you want to ask.
Absolutely. So we were, my name's Holly Pitt from Missing People. We were wondering if funders will be more inclined to award core unrestricted funding over the next 1 to 3 years to help charities like ourselves to weather the storm and allow us to have more autonomy over how we allocate funds to support our families and people across the board.
Would anyone like to go first, or shall I just pick one of the funders at random? Katherine, would you like to go first?
Hi, Holly. Yes, I think it's so important. So one of the first things that we did at the start of this crisis was get in touch with current grant holders and community programmes and let them know that those grants were now completely unrestricted. And it was really interesting because we hadn't done that before. And I think that this awful situation has encouraged us to adapt and, you know, understand that unrestricted funding is possible. You know, we have that flexible funding with our regular beneficiaries, but then kind of trying to do it with our community programs, kind of smaller charities. It's been a really good opportunity to do that. And going forward, kind of we absolutely understand that core funding is going to have to be an important part of what we do. And yeah, it sort of sped us up, I think, this situation, and made us get there sooner. And we haven't confirmed all our strategy for next year yet, so I can't speak 100% on it, but core funding needs to be a focus of it.
Can I ask if any of the other panelists would like to come in?
Yeah, Stewart would. After you, Stewart.
Cheers, Neil. You know, it's interesting because I think more and more funders are responding to what's happened as a result of the coronavirus pandemic. But you know, we've always tried to maintain that really strong relationship with the sector. And when we carried out our stakeholder consultation, what you'll see when we start to give some of the kind of key changes to the new funding offer is that you asked and we listened. And so it's a direct response to things that people have been telling us for a number of years, actually, and it isn't an immediate knee-jerk reaction to what's happened during this pandemic. I think we always struggled to make it clear who was eligible for core unrestricted funding and who wasn't. Eligibility is a really tough thing when you're such a broad funder and you don't have discrete programs. But I think with that sharpened focus around poverty and trauma, we can be a lot clearer in who the organisations we want to work with in a much longer term and a more unrestricted funding relationship. And that's so important because we're seeing it as a result of funders unrestricting awards, and you're seeing the benefit of that, albeit in a short term, how much of a useful investment that is into the sector and what the sector can do with that really small level of core unrestricted funding. So I completely agree. More unrestricted for much longer, I think, is what's needed.
Neil.
Yeah, on the back of Stewart saying that, I think he's probably right, but that's not what we'll be able to do. So national lottery funding does have some parameters around it in terms of being time limited and linked to specific outcomes, and that has translated over the years into being about project funding. And that's a challenge for us because we know that actually organisations need flexibility and freedom to get on with stuff. So I think for us, it's about recognising the wide scope of project costs. And also, I think the really important thing is about how you manage that. So how do you manage funding as a partnership? We totally recognise that the minute you start a project, it varies from the thing you wrote down that you thought was going to happen. And what I would hope people's experience has been of working with us is that we'll talk to you about that and find ways of working with the grain of those changes and challenges. And if anything, that's been really hammered home just the importance of that kind of flexibility and that partnership approach in managing grants, because it's easy to make your application stuff smooth, but it's the 5 years after that of how you manage that relationship that really makes a difference to folks. So that's where we try to be as flexible as we can.
Ben, you'd like to come in?
Just very briefly, I don't want to be, you know, we're being collaborative here, and I don't want to be adversarial, but I really think we have to hold funders' feet to the fire on this one. And I think the key question is, what is it reasonable and possible to expect from an applicant at the moment about their long-term plan? And I think the answer is that we can expect people to be clear about their mission, and we can expect people to be clear about the needs they're trying to meet. But when we start to get into how much need they can meet and how they can meet that need, we're subject to a lot of variables, aren't we? With things expanding and retracting. And therefore, the idea that project funding, with its traditional linkages to specific outputs and outcomes, is fit for purpose, I think we've really got to question that. At the moment, you know, what we can be confident about is our core, and that is what we need to be funded. Someone said to me yesterday on one of our online sessions, then trust us. We know how to do it and we do it well. And boy, have we seen that in the last 6 months. So I think that we've got to be bold and brave about how much we push on that. I accept that there are people on this screen who have been in the core funding game for a long time, but the reality is it's taken a global pandemic for trusts and foundations to wake up to the fact that that is the funding that brings the best out of people.
Thank you, Ben. Paul Copeland, I understand that you've got a question.
Yeah, maybe this isn't applicable to the funders that are in front of me today, but in the past we have come unstuck because of the issue of reserves. So reserves seemed as if you're awash with money, but really wasn't. It was good governance and good planning. So going forward, what do the funders think in terms of the issue of reserves? Will it preclude organisations from applying, or will they be more flexible in terms of the reserves that people hold, which really are needed in times of crisis such as this?
Thank you, Paul. Neil, would you like to go next?
Yeah, I think folk better be flexible about reserves, or quite frankly, won't be able to fund anyone, to be honest. And the issue isn't going to be that people have too much. For a long time, we've tried to worry less about reserves and more about what folk are trying to achieve. And I think that's the challenge. Some funders will make that call. When the thing about funding is you're always trying to give not enough money across too many good ideas, and every choice you make is a choice about not funding something else. And there'll be times when for some funders it's right to use the relative reserves of organisations as a way of splitting the difference. But yeah, reserves has felt like a really, really difficult thing lately, Paul, hasn't it? Because early in the crisis, organisations almost felt like they were being punished for good management, for building up sensible reserves. And then later on in the funding game, people will be challenged because they don't look sustainable, because they don't have enough reserves. So I think reserves have got to be kept in context in terms of what the organisation is trying to do and what other factors tell you about the sustainability of that organisation and how that works. Because if you're in the business of funding folk, then getting all antsy because folk have managed their finances well is a wee bit odd.
Very much agreed. Any other panel would like to respond? Katherine, and then Stewart.
Yeah, with reserves, it's definitely not something that's kind of playing a large part in our decision making at the moment. I suppose the thing that we do like to see if an organisation has incredibly high reserves is that they're there for a reason. So, you know, I'm talking about organisations that maybe have sort of 10 years worth of turnover in reserves. You know, we do like a bit of an explanation that they're needing to be there because you're needing to purchase a building, or other income streams are really unstable at the moment, and just kind of have that understanding. Because yeah, sometimes you are looking at two organisations that have scored very similarly in all other ways, but one has far higher reserves. We just need to see that kind of explanation there as to why.
Yeah, I'll just follow on from the 2 points here. I think you know, we're asking people to be agile, you know, asking applicants to be agile, but then expecting them to keep a really tight ship in terms of their financial controls and not have too much reserves, but make sure they've got enough to continue. We need to be agile as well in our expectations of applicants and organisations. We need to recognise that you need to start where possible to build up those reserves again, where you can. We need to recognise that not everybody writing funding applications are accountants and can provide that really kind of strong context and rationale as to why something looks the way it does in a set of accounts. I think it's just taking you know, as Katherine said, trying to just take a logical view of somebody's accounts and just having a little bit of empathy and understanding the position that organisation's in. Yeah, but you know, I agree with Neil's earlier points as well, that we just need to work with you. You know, we're here, we want to have that relationship with you, we want to have a communication, and we understand the pressure that the sector is facing. The financial pressures are enormous, immense. We've never felt anything like this. So accounts are going to look different as well. So we have to learn and adapt to that as you submit them. We're not going to know what they look like until they're submitted. So we're going to be learning along with you, and we're open and receptive to that feedback from you and the challenges that you face in even preparing your accounts and presenting them.
Thank you so much. Really helpful responses. Chrissy, can I ask you to come in with your question?
Thank you, Talat. So I was just wondering, given that, you know, funders are in this very privileged position to have all the input from the organisations that they support, that surely, you know, there's been this huge change in the context that everyone's operating in, and that means that, you know, there will be things that are working and are not working, and people are trying new stuff, and they're often doing it on the hoof, and, you know, reacting to very different circumstances. And so there will be that learning around that, that presumably could be really useful for other organizations, and that may be being shared in an informal way, and then maybe it's also not. And that kind of links back to those points that I think came up in the earlier session about funders encouraging honesty and encouraging people to share what didn't work, so that then that positive learning can come from it, and the actual practice can be strengthened. And so can we as funders kind of in a way encourage those conversations by making a safe space to share what didn't work as well as what worked, and to help facilitate those conversations happening between the kind of people who would most benefit from that information and that learning. And I feel that maybe that's one of those roles that we should have, particularly in this crazy context of huge change for so many, and that facilitating discussions in particular practice areas, I don't know, organizations that are working with children and young people, for example, huge change in the way that so many of them would work. Could we help facilitate that sharing of learning given this new context, and how might we do that and encourage it?
So who would like to come in on that first? Can I ask Ben, would you like to?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in there, and I do think that something has changed, not least because we've all spent time in strangers' bedrooms but in a way that is legal. And you know, I mercifully am not interrupted, but when I was working with the Robertson Trust trustees a couple of months ago, I was being harassed in my garden shed by one of my children as to whether they could watch The Hobbit, and it eventually appeared on the screen. So real life has intervened, and in a way I think that has leveled things out. Now the risk is that, you know, learned behaviors are very powerful, and the risk of defaulting into those I think is very strong. And I think trustees of foundations have not traditionally been as relaxed about risk and these different approaches to due diligence as we're talking about today. So there is a big task in boardrooms, can I say, I think, to square that off. I think secondly, in terms of learning, I want to do a shout out for a learning review that we have just initiated and that Corra and Bernardo Scotland are involved in from north of the border, to look at how we can sustain progressive practice beyond the immediate emergency. And I think there is a real groundswell of appetite and energy for doing something different, and for beginning to try and codify that in a way that protects it from some of the kind of vicissitudes of normal life. The third thing is, I think funders, you know, you have got great convening power. You need to use it carefully and wisely. So whilst on the one hand there has been a leveling off, there is always that, you know, there's a built-in asymmetry to the relationship. So we have to be respectful and mindful of that. And so it may be that you can enable these things to happen, but you don't always need to be present inside all of the conversations.
Okay, if there isn't a burning response from panelists, I'd like to go to more questions, if that's okay. Kathy, can I ask you to come in with your question?
Yeah, thanks very much. I absolutely agree that emergency funding is absolutely critical, and we've been very grateful for it. But we can't think about this in isolation. I think we absolutely have to think about emergency funding, all funding, as part of the bigger picture. So long-term thinking, planning and implementation is really, really important to keep on the table. We have, for example, just heard from the Deputy First Minister that the bill to incorporate the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child has been introduced to the Scottish Parliament. It will hopefully be part of our legislative process as from in spring next year. It's critically important that funders understand this, what it means, what the potential of it is, because it has the potential to transform childhood. And if we get childhood right and better, then that transforms a myriad of things throughout people's lives. So I'm interested in knowing who would be willing to host a conversation for managing inclusive conversations where all the voices are heard, not just the loudest or the most established. Because if we're going to see long-term change, then we need to think about how do we change our thinking, our planning, and our implementation strategies. Because if we don't change that, we won't change what we do and how we do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. Katherine, can I come to you for your thoughts?
Yeah, Kathy, I think you make so many good points that are so important. I suppose from the community programs perspective at Postcode Lottery, sometimes we feel like we're so far the other way in terms of light touch that it sometimes makes it hard to then actually facilitate those conversations, because we're a team of 5 people supporting over kind of 2,000 organisations that we fund a year. It's difficult for us to perhaps facilitate those meaningful conversations, and we kind of rely on the organisations being the experts and telling us what they need, rather than us being the experts. We're very much kind of generalist across a lot of subject areas, and kind of listening to them as as experts. I suppose kind of as a funder, I really think it's important to get together with other funders and then charities working in those areas and actually listen to what they need. And I think, like, I've been happy that we've started to do that more, and being able to do it virtually has really sort of being forced to do things virtually has helped us in this time. So we do kind of funding workshops across the country, and because we were doing it virtually, we were able to do more of those and included a lot more discussion at the end on what those organisations actually need. So I do think this time has encouraged those conversations, but I think we're not there yet. And I think at the moment we're so stressed with sort of getting as much money out to as many organisations as possible that that's filling our headspace. But yes, we do need to look forward to.
Would any of the other funders like to come in about things beyond the funding itself, creating that space for learning and sharing and strategizing? Neil?
Yeah, just a couple of things. I think a lot of funders have been kind of busy just keeping the wheels turning and trying to make sure resources move out to folk. But I think we're now getting to a place where we have to pause and reflect a wee bit and give ourselves time to think. And there's 2 things to balance here. There's an urgency and an opportunity, but some of this is too important to do too fast, I think, as well. So from our point of view, what we're going to try and do is balance those things and keep resources flowing, while at the same time getting into a whole range of conversations about how you do funding better, how you do funding differently, how do we make sure that all of the voices that we need to hear are influencing our policy and practice. I think Corra have been doing some really interesting work in this field. I think Stewart and his colleagues at Robertson have been doing that and shaping their strategy. And I think the fora where funders come together in Scotland, like Scottish Grantmakers or the Funders Forum, have been frankly a wee bit tied up taking care of business back at the ranch, and it's time for some of those organisations to come out blinking into the sunlight again and figure out what the hell this all means and how we do stuff better. And one of the areas that's really interesting, Kathy, is that kind of rights-based work and how we use that to develop projects that make a real difference. And it's about that partnership of taking the money we are trusted with and using that for social good and doing that well. And I think some of that collegiate work also speaks to Chrissy's point about how we do learning better and how we share the things that have felt brilliant and the things that frankly haven't gone well. We really need to be open about that. And I would say my experience of kicking around this world for about 20 years is the funders are open to those conversations about things that haven't gone well. And some of the reluctance to me feels like it comes from a kind of old-fashioned attitude about money and power. And I would again remind folk that funders are nothing without the folk who run projects. And if we don't learn from things that don't go well, we'll not get any better. So gather up your courage and tell us when things haven't gone well, and tell us when we haven't done things well as well. I think you're mute, Talent.
Oh, it's me that's mute. Stewart, would you still like to come in?
Yeah, sorry, I think it's probably worth continuing the point. A really good question, Kathy. As Ben alluded to earlier, my feet are getting well and truly hot now with that type of question. I think it's really important, the point you made about long-term thinking, and I think funders need to recognise the difference between that early intervention and help and versus that immediate need, and fund both aspects of it. The point you make about, or actually that we've all made about listening to organisations, listening to grant holders, being agile and changing, it does seem all very quite one-sided, and that we're here waiting to listen to you, whereas actually what we need to do is take a bit of a bold step forward into kind of co-production, working with you. Think about, I'm always struck by the way that homelessness services in Glasgow were funded, the same way for 35 years, and it takes a small catalyst to say, actually, we've got a smaller pot of money, but you can be responsible for how it's spent because you know what services are the best services to deliver in order to overcome some of these challenges. So looking at things like alliance commissioning, participatory grant making, these are things that funders are all looking at and are definitely I guess we're feeling braver now, given all that's went on in the past few months, but it's certainly a space that we want to do so. I mean, it's not just listening to you, it's acting, it's taking action following that listening piece and giving you guys some of that power as well. You talked earlier about the power dynamic that's been discussed today. We definitely want to shift that power imbalance. And I think with our independence comes that flexibility to do so. So I think certainly over the next 10 years, we're not experts in that area. We haven't been doing it for a long while, but we're definitely ready to take the step into that area with your help and support.
Thank you. Thank you to our funders panel. It's been really useful. I know there was a couple of questions that came in that didn't get answered, but that doesn't mean they won't get answered. We've got them here in the chat function and we can maybe send round and find a way to be able to capture that and respond to you all. It has been really helpful to be able to hear from funders directly, but I do recall what Ben was saying about holding funders' feet to the fire on what has been learnt during this time, and if there's been flexibility, rapid response during this time, how can that be maintained, knowing that actually there will be crises, or there will be specific community interventions that need to happen through our organisations. So thinking about how we can make that happen, how that accountability can happen, is a job for all of us now, to think about how we come together and do a little bit of that, whilst of course remaining friendly. So thank you very much to the funders panel for that.